This is an audio description video of a panel hosted by Indigenous Curatorial Collective and in partnership with Nia Centre for the Arts. My name is Keisha Irwin, and I'm the events coordinator intern for this gathering and will be providing audio description as best as I can. Just a note, every participant will be giving an image description of themselves as they introduce themselves. During the introduction, a song plays that was written and created by one of the panelists, named Jamaias DaCosta. During their song, the song's title, which is Flint and Fire, and the artist's name shows up in white text at the bottom of the screen. After that disappears, text appears in the middle that says the title of the panel, Exploring Solidarity and Intersections, and in smaller text below it, it says, hosted in partnership with Nia Centre for the Arts and Indigenous Curatorial Collective. After that disappears off screen, the names of the panelists and their images appear. The panelists are Jamaias DaCosta, Ekow, Miali-Elise Coley-Sudlovenick, and Joan. Afterward, text introduces Alica, who is the executive director for the Nia Centre for the Arts, as the one guiding the conversation.
I'm everywhere and nowhere and nowhere. I am blood memory. I am neither here nor there. I am everywhere and nowhere. I am blood memory. Colonial constructional contracts, bred in halves and quarters, fifths and eighths. Multi-grained, you can call me. Mixed, just don't call me mixed up. You want to deny me and you try. You want to erase me, upset as you are with the conundrum of events resulting in the tendrils of my tangled roots. Do not speak for me to say I am confused when I tell you my limbs are planted here on Turtle Island and stretch in long, sinewy paths across oceans. My ancestors represent 4 and 4 more directions. Conflictual collision is in my blood. Flint and fire and earth, I was birthed, breaching boundaries and comfort zones. My very existence offends you, but I am not sorry.
Hello, everyone. My name is Alica, and I'm the Executive Director of Nia Centre for the Arts. I want to begin with a visual description of myself. I am a brown-skinned Black woman. I'm wearing a cheetah print head wrap. I have thick eyebrows and a full nose and full lips and gold studs in my ears. And I'm wearing a black and white t-shirt with a visual graphic by Olusegun Ogunlesi, the local artist. Yeah, I work with Nia Centre. We are a Black arts organization with a mission to support and showcase art from the Afro diaspora. We work with artists in a range of disciplines and from a range of backgrounds. And right now we're working on a project to renovate our facility to create Canada's first professional multidisciplinary art center that's dedicated to artists and artistic traditions from the Afro diaspora. So we're really thrilled that we're able to create this space to explore Afro-Indigeneity and mixed race experiences with the Indigenous Curatorial Collective. I want to acknowledge that today this is also a meeting of our ancestors, and that we here based in Toronto are on the traditional lands of the Wendat peoples, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, as well as the Six Nations of the Grand River. And I also want to mention that we're all treaty people, including those of us who came here as settlers, as migrants, either in this generation or in previous generations, involuntarily as well as a result of the transatlantic slave trade. Today, I also want to pay tribute to our ancestors of African descent, who are also a part of an Indigenous community and who, as a community here, we form a diaspora as descendants of those people. And so today, for me, is a truly unique opportunity for us to commune in a new way with our ancestors from multiple lands. So I'm truly excited for you folks to see the conversation that we had and the discussion, and welcoming you on behalf of Nia Centre for the Arts.
Danse, Gilawao, hi everyone. On behalf of the Indigenous Curatorial Collective, I would like to welcome you to this intimate discussion hosted in partnership with the Nia Centre of the Arts, whose mission is to support and showcase art in the African diaspora. My name is Keisha Irwin. I'm the events coordinator intern at the ICCA, and I'll begin with a visual description of myself for folks who are blind and are partially sighted. I am Afro-Indigenous. I am visibly lighter skinned Black. I have on a gold septum piercing and white and gold beaded fringe earrings. I have on brown and gold eyeshadow as well as brown lipstick. I have short, curly, froey black hair, and I have on a black long-sleeved crew neck with gold writing that says Black Liberation, Indigenous Sovereignty. First off, I would like to recognize that I'm recording this on Treaty 6 in Métis homeland, specifically Nehewak-Askish in northern Saskatchewan. ICCA operates in what is colonially known as Toronto, which is the anglicized version of a Mohawk word, which means where the trees stand in water. ICCA operates on Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Wendat lands. Many of the artists who are partaking in this discussion are Indigenous to the territory covered by the Dishutlan Wampum. One of the artists is Inuk and calling in from Inuit Nunangat. Despite this all being Indigenous lands, we now live in a society that was founded on Indigenous displacement, dispossession, as well as Indigenous erasure, and a society that was founded on anti-Black racism. This intimate conversation explores the individual artistic practices of 4 Afro-Indigenous and other mixed-race artists as it relates to solidarity, visibility, intersections, and community belonging. If folks want to ask the panelists some questions, please join our Q&A session taking place on November 23rd at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time.
All right, I'm Ekow, Ekow Stone. I have light brown skin, freckles, broadish nose, full lips, no hair right now. Normally have kind of an afro going, but I'm trying something different. I'm an artist and farmer based here in Toronto. I got a mustache too.
Sego Kai Youngyat Swakskare Wage Ganyange Hanewagohan Soden. Hello, my name is Kaya or Kaya Joan. I am light skinned. I have a kind of shaved head. I'm wearing purple circular earrings. I have a septum piercing, and I'm wearing a colorful knit sweater, and the background is dark and irrelevant, I guess. I go by they, them, or she, her pronouns. I sit with Bear Clan, and I am Ganyange Haga by way of my maternal grandmother, with my relations from Gahnawage, as well as her being Irish, and my maternal grandfather is from Jamaica, and then my paternal grandparents are from Bequia. I was born and raised in Toronto, where the trees stand tall in the water, or also known as Toronto, dish with one spoon treaty territory. I'm a multidisciplinary artist. I work within themes of my own ancestry and bringing forth stories. I'm a story weaver. My artwork is about being in a deep practice of listening to the land, understanding my relationship to place, specifically my relationship to Toronto as someone who is Afro-Indigenous, as someone who is displaced and of the diaspora. As well, I love working within themes of Black and Indigenous futurisms, and working with how technology extends beyond the material, and story as technology. So that's a little bit about me.
Hi, I'm Miali-Elise, Miali Coley-Sudlovenick, Tamani Ekalonitunga Inuit Nunanganit, Tamani Peroximalunga, Tana Okausa Atoktara Inutiturtu. Thank you for welcoming me. I'm Miali Coley-Sudlovenick. I have dark curly hair. Well, I would say wavy. It's not a tight curl. I'm currently wearing a headband which has matta, which is whale skin pieces on there. I'm wearing broad glasses that I ordered pretty cheap online. but I still need them. And I'm wearing earrings that were made by an Inuk. I believe they're muskox, and this is a silapa that's also made out of Cambridge Bay by sisters Nukarit. And I would say, medium brown skin. I have a long, wide face with broad nostrils, and I have a long neck. I'm here, born and raised in Inuit Nunangat, specifically in Iqaluit. My mother is Inuk, and she was born in an outpost camp called Ukialibillo in South Baffin. And her mother's father was actually Scottish, but she was raised by her Inuk father, and but still carried her Scottish last name. And then my father immigrated from Mandeville, Manchester, Jamaica to Toronto area when he was approximately, I believe, 9 years old. And he came up north when he was 19 to Frobisher Bay, and where I have been raised by mainly my Inuit family, with strong connections and ties to my father and my Jamaican family. I identify as she, her, and I have a husband and 2 children. And my first language is Inuktitut. I do a lot of work around our language, whether it's teaching or learning. And I also consider myself to be a gatherer. My husband is more of the hunter. I have hunted before, but gathering is a big part of my connection and what I do in terms of my connection as an Inuk to the land. And I am a writer. I write, and I have a play that I've put out that has a story in relation to my connection to the land, but also just one that explores identity. So I am Coley-Sudlovenick. Nakome.
Welcome. Thank you so much for that. Big up Mandeville. Big up Jamaica. And yes, Blackberries, part of CBC Gem and Obsidian's 21 Black Futures. I'm definitely feel like we'll be able to like insert a link at the very least as part of this. So excited for folks to as well see that story as part of this conversation.
Sego swagwegong, Jamaias niangyats, waganyang gehaga, dahnon, Jawega, dahnon, Arisakage, dahnon, waganyati sadoko, Ginagonrat, Waxkalewage, Dagarando, Zewato Guatzarat, Ganagari, Ganyangeha, Gadawayansta. So hello, everybody. My name is Jamaias. I have brown hair with lots of gray roots right now. I also have kind of a long face. I've got brown eyes. I'm wearing a brown sweater. Lots of fall going on today. And I'm wearing beaded earrings that have a black top and then kind of a fire theme dangling down below, and I beaded those last winter. I am of the people of the Flint. I'm also of the people from Jamaica. I'm also of the people from Ireland. I'm also from all of my ancestors. So I am multiracial. I'm light-skinned, and I am Bear Clan. I am living and from Toronto. I'm living in Toronto, and that's where I'm from. I'm a multidisciplinary artist. I'm a DJ. I'm a spoken word artist. I'm a writer. I'm an arts programmer and collaborator various collectives. I am a mother. I am the proud mother of Kaya, and I go by she and they pronouns. And I'm very happy to be here. My father is from Mandeville. That's why I reacted when you mentioned that your father was from Mandeville. That's where my father is from. He migrated to Canada when he was 15 in 1965. He brought his siblings over. Actually, they came over by themselves because my grandparents were already here. They had come ahead of time to establish themselves in London, Ontario, and that's where he moved to. And then he and my mother met in the 70s in Toronto, and that's where I was born and raised. Though I did live in Jamaica briefly as a child in Kingston. I spent just a couple of years there and then came back.
So thank you all for being here with us and having a really generative and intimate conversation on intersecting identities and solidarity across communities. There's already so much rich lineage and shared history within that lineage. I love how Mandeville is a shared place despite being so many thousands of kilometers away. And yeah, for telling us a bit about your sort of artistic practices and what brings you to the parts of Turtle Island that you're sort of calling in from or speaking in from. I wondered if we could start talking a bit about art and artistic practices and what inspires us and what themes and sort of things we're interested in exploring through the art that we create.
I can kick us off. Artistic themes, practices. So yeah, I mentioned that I work a lot with story and I consider myself a storyteller. I'm multidisciplinary, so I work in a lot of different mediums like visual arts, painting, illustration, filmmaking. I also love to work in music and sound design, and I write. I just like to tell stories. And in terms of the stories that I do tell, I'm thinking a lot about blood memory and the stories of my ancestors that live through me and ways in which I orient myself towards those stories and the relationship that I have with them, because a lot of my ancestral stories I've been disconnected from as I've, growing up in Toronto. This is not necessarily my home territory. My ancestors are from all over the place. So
Kaya's video gets smaller and moves to the left. An image appears on screen of an illustration that Kaya has done. This illustration is titled, "The One Who Offers Seed." Seed is written in the Mohawk language, and this was done in 2020. The background is black, and there are two circles in the illustration. One of the circles is in the center and is a dark orange with an illustration of a brown person in the middle. This person is holding the element of fire in their right hand and water in their left hand. Their head is not connected to their body, but hovers over their neck and is surrounded by the color baby blue in what seems to be an afro. Out of their neck flows green blobs with orange circles in the middle. Brown roots spread from underneath the dark orange circle, and purple roots connect it to the yellow smaller circle below. The image of the illustration then disappears and Kaya's video moves to the center and becomes large again.
A lot of my art practice is kind of like mapping out those stories and how they show up for me. My art is a safe space to explore my relationship to myself and all parts of myself. And yeah, really investigating what it means for me to be in a deep relationship with land, both physical and beyond physical aspects of land, and exploring barriers to accessing land. In Toronto, there's a lot of, of course, colonial infrastructure. This city was built on top of a system of really rich rivers and tributaries that are still running today. And I see a parallel between those rivers and my own histories and stories within myself. So I often use the land and as a metaphor for looking at myself and how I exist in the world. And yeah, I mentioned as well that Black and Indigenous futurisms are very influential to my practice. So looking at story as a tool, as a compass, looking at land as archives. Octavia Butler is also really inspiring to me. Her ideas around change and adaptation are really interesting to me. And yeah, I feel like I could just keep rambling and I don't want to take up too much space, but that's a little bit about the themes that I'm currently investigating in my practice.
I would say that for the beginning and earlier stages of my life and upbringing, I was really involved in singing. And it was something that I always enjoyed, and I've participated in performances as well as learning throat singing and performing for audiences. And it was something I pulled back a bit on, possibly to do with my own feelings around identity and the way that I was kind of reflected back on in terms of being a performer. It's still something that I'm coming to terms with when I speak about it, but it's not something I hold a grudge on. It's more just, it's been something that I've processed a bit over the years. And then in regards to, and it's still something like I'll still throat sing, but I have taught it before. And then for my continuation on the artist side of things, I often will take time to learn to do like make traditional clothing and prepare skins when I have the opportunity. And I'm sure I have many opportunities, but I haven't prioritized it as much as I'd like to. And it's something that my mom reclaimed a lot of her traditional skills around sewing in her 40s, because there were many opportunities that she was not able to also partake in, not by choice. And so with her own experiences, I feel like sometimes I have a tendency to hold back opportunities that are available to me. And then in regards to my writing, it's something that I have always been very engaged in, whether it was through journaling throughout my entire teens. It was the only, one of the only ways I could truly express myself in a very much more less verbally expressive upbringing that I had within the spaces that I have been in. And so I feel like writing has been a huge outlet for me. And it was only recently that I've gotten into, well, maybe not, on and off since in the last 10 to 15 years, where I've explored opportunities to share my writing and then also join spaces that could demonstrate the writing that I've been able to share. I don't know how to explain that exactly, but I guess in relation to Blackberries, having written, writing for me has been a huge part of my way of really connecting to a part of me that really yearns to express. So that's, and then of course, I often will help my mom when she's doing a lot of her cultural work and practices. And I still feel like I don't feel qualified to really call myself an artist in the spaces that she is reclaiming, but I would call myself her apprentice in some of those areas. So with sewing and so forth.
That's beautiful.
Thank you.
Do you find that, I guess in some of the stories that you're drawn to tell, that they represent both of your identities, or do you find that you're, I guess does it influence at all what characters or what stories you tell?
Only last year did I really feel the courage to.
Miali's video fades out and an image fades in. This image is a still shot from a play written by Miali called Blackberries. On this still, the whole set is visible. with a background of painted blue sky, green hills, and a blue river. These elements are used to create the feeling of Nunavut. On the right side, there is an upper body of a visible brown person who is also visibly racialized as Black, and they are sitting down and staring off into the distance. They have short afro-textured hair. They are sitting on the ground and are wearing a purple head wrap, a purple shirt, and a purple jacket over top. On the left side, there are purple flowers on the ground. The image of the still shot then disappears and Miali's video appears again.
To produce something that was both Inuk and Jamaican visually, where it was able to be portrayed, and mostly probably because it was the first time I was ever asked to take part in something in that type of way. When I write, I don't write as, I just write as myself. I don't know how to separate myself in terms of being one or the other, just because I have so much influence from both of the family that I grew up in. And so even when I write from my perspective as an Inuk, it's always influenced by things that I've seen as a Jamaican, things that I've seen with my dad and all the things that he talks about and what he shares. So I don't know how to separate those two. There's been times where I've had people try to box me into really trying to be more Inuk or trying to say that I'm more Jamaican or I'm more Black, and I don't give into those perspectives. And so that's been something that's always just, it's been a challenge, but also my mom's been very instrumental in really just making sure that I don't feel any less of being who I am, regardless of what people might see when they see me and want to identify me a certain way.
Yeah, I was thinking about this one when I saw this question earlier, and like, what are the themes? I think similar to my daughter, I'm very much inspired by the environment that I'm around. I'm very interested in uncovering that which has been erased or covered up because of colonial influence and white supremacy, which is a theme on both sides of my family, being multiracial. So I'm very interested in those stories that emerge through blood memory, and thinking about how to carry it all forward in a good way, in a way that's responsible, in a way that is not appropriating. I'm very conscious of being light-skinned, so that's something that I'm also exploring. And I think in my writing I talk about that, and thinking just of the ways in which that complicates those reconnections. And yeah, just trying to be mindful of where I step and how I step. That's something that I think is also kind of, I don't want to say it's a theme, but it's something that I carry with me. So it depends on what I'm doing. As a DJ, I'm very interested in representing Black and Indigenous artists, like Black and or Indigenous artists. That's the artists that I play tend to be Black and or Indigenous. And it's because that's the roots of the music that I'm playing. That's where they come from. So I prefer to honor the roots of and the history of that music by playing those artists and highlighting those artists, particularly local artists. I really like to highlight, the local Toronto. We have a lot of talent here in Toronto, and then like across Turtle Island as well. But I really resonated with what you said, Miali, about like, there's no separating, like, oh, my Jamaican identity and then, my Mohawk identity. There's no separating it. So it's all kind of infused together. And there is always somebody who has an opinion about, your identity, if it's not really straightforward for them to understand. And I really appreciate what you said, Miali, about resisting that. And that's something that has been a work in progress for me, is resisting, people's opinions about it. And just being comfortable with acknowledging that, yeah, I don't look like that, but that's who I am, and being kind of unapologetic about it. And I think that that's important also. So it's like being mindful, but also just asserting that this is who I am. And that's in honor of my ancestors who have been erased, who have been denied, because my maternal grandfather, his family is from Ganawage, but his grandparents actually left the reserve, and they did that probably so that they could work, and because back then, you couldn't work, especially you couldn't leave the reserve, so you would have to make a choice. And I think that the choice that they made was for survival. I don't understand it, but that's the choice that they made. So then my grandfather was raised to deny being Mohawk, then to hide it. And that theme exists on my Jamaican side. So all of us here who are of Caribbean descent understand shadeism in the Caribbean. It's a result of colonial white supremacy, and it runs rampant in my family. So both of my grandparents have Black ancestry, like one generation, like within their parents, but they won't acknowledge it necessarily. I mean, now they will, but growing up, it was not something that was acknowledged. So there's that erasure again. So for me, there's a lot of personal healing that happens in whatever kind of work that I'm doing. I'm always centering that, healing the pain of erasure and balancing that with, the way I present. So it's all of those things are tied up in everything I do, I think. And even how I raise my own daughter, and conversations about these things were something that we had a lot, as she was navigating all of the fun experiences of other people's opinions about, what you look like or who you are. And then there's, oftentimes people want you to make a choice, or they think you're confused. So it's very interesting, how much other people's opinions about our identities can really convolute who we are if we allow it to. So it's really, it's really, I think, part of the healing is just sort of asserting that while also acknowledging the complexity of existing in white supremacy and being light-skinned of this ancestry.
Such beautiful reflections. I feel like, it still exists now. I feel like, there is more recognition that Blackness is expansive as more people stand at that intersection and sort of complicate what we understand Black to mean. But there's still, of course, growing up, and everyone has this tension of like, not everyone, but lots of people who stand at different intersections have this tension of feeling like, oh, I have to choose, or I have to prove, or Blackness is only this, very narrow thing. And I was reflecting on why that might be. Like, why do we do that? Why do we hold on to like such a very narrow idea of what Blackness can be? And my only thought was thinking maybe that it's in being oppressed, you feel like you want to build solidarity of people who you believe have the same experience as you. And so you want to define that, who was part of your community as a way to say, oh, well, you understand and So it's that trying to find solidarity in a struggle. But I feel like we've grown as broadly saying us as a community over the years to understand Blackness in more expansive ways, but there's still so much more ways that you can be Black. And it's still, I think, it's just a growing conversation. And I think it's part of what we're doing today is pushing those boundaries and showing the expansiveness of what it can be.
Yeah, and I think it's insidious because, what you're saying is really a key. People need to see themselves reflected in their community and understand that people are that relationship of shared experience is there. And I reflect a lot on the way that, we're constantly dividing ourselves, because of things like shadeism, because of things like tokenism and preference to those in closer proximity to whiteness, in terms of like who gets the position, who gets the offer of, the opportunity, etc. And then I think the anxiety of talking about it, period. So I always lead with it because I'm like, it's an elephant. I'm just going to name it. I want to talk about it. I think we need to talk about it more, and find ways. So I spend a lot of time talking with my other like multiracial friends who, are mixed with white. So it's very specific for those who are mixed with white. It's, I think, a different experience for Black folks who are mixed, with Inuk, or something that doesn't include that colonial white supremacy legacy.
That's a really good point, Jamai. Mamiana, is it Jamaias? In regards to that difference, because one of the things that I realized too is even though my grandmother was half white, I don't associate myself with the white ancestry within my line, even though, yes, it does exist. I don't ever deny that it exists. And I will always acknowledge it, but I've never known how to connect with it because I actually don't know and haven't gone to Scotland and I haven't spent time there. I would say the closest thing I have to really associating myself with that side would be the white friends that I grew up with and the conversations that I've been able to kind of try to understand life through their lens. And then I have friends who are half white, half Inuk. And it's always interesting to see the difference that they feel around their identity versus my friends who are full Inuk. And that's always been a really, for me, I find it fun. I don't know. I don't think it's very fun for a lot of people to have to always feel the pressure of explaining, where they come from, who they are, and all of that. But for me, I find it that exploration, that side of it, that feeling of like trying to get to know some of those identity pieces to be always really exciting. And I just love to explore how people perceive themselves around some of those ways. And so, people will try to make it seem like, oh, like, don't you feel like they want me to feel bad, or they want me to feel less than, or that I'm supposed to somehow feel like I was left out of something, or like, oh, we're all the did all the I don't know, I won't give any examples now, but I will once we get more into the conversations. But I love these type of like experiences to try to understand it, but also relish in the fact that I will never really understand it. And so I just always think it's neat to explore. So thanks for bringing that up.
It's definitely a great position to work from. Enjoying it because there's, there's so many aspects of identity too, right? Like we're just touching on one today, but there's so many intersections to explore. Ekow, did you want to talk about your intersections?
I've been just listening. It's interesting. A lot of, I guess I'll talk a little bit about my art practice, like kind of harkening back to that a little bit, and then maybe it'll connect in ways. I guess my work is like very interested in like ancient history and worlds and ways of being that exist outside of our current world and way of being. And so I really like just to go to museums and look at like objects from thousands of years ago that are kind of imbued and charged with their own like energy, spiritual energy, even though it might be something as simple as like a spoon that's carved in a certain way. It has like a certain significance. It's used for a specific ceremony, or, you know, carvings of like ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, or I really love cave paintings. I think that like the human figures in ancient cave paintings are, nobody's been able to top them since. And I guess I don't know why I do that. I guess it began first because I was like doodling at a coffee shop when I was 19, just like working on stuff. And then I really liked modern art, like Matisse, Picasso, Gauguin, etc. And then I realized that they were just kind of part of a particular colonial period, the scramble for Africa, the turn of the century, right? All of these objects and things were kind of coming back into Europe. And they were very inspired by these things. And so I was just like, oh, well, you could skip over those guys and go to the source to an extent. But, I'm always seeing them in a certain context that I know is very, I guess, problematic. Museums and institutions like that have their own legacy, but aesthetically, I just find them very, very appealing. And so that's kind of, I like to kind of mimic that, or try to, that's kind of my measuring stick with my work, was just like, am I kind of able to evoke 10% of what these ancient peoples were able to invoke in their work? But yeah, I don't know how that it really, in terms of my intersections, I grew up in a pretty white place. Victoria, British Columbia is pretty white. And that was an earlier inspiration for my work, in terms of just being in a very white environment. But in West Coast, they really like totem poles. And so some of the tallest structures in small West Coast areas will actually be totem poles. And I always thought they were just the most marvelous, beautiful things. They were just so aesthetically appealing. So for a while, a lot of that inspired my work, but then I distanced myself because it's not really my ancestry. It's not my culture. But yeah, the West Coast is pretty white, and I have a Black father, and I look the way I do. So, I never really, until I moved to Toronto, and met way more different Black people of different backgrounds and stuff like that, came into a proper understanding of being light-skinned and understanding that sort of difference, because I guess with everybody else who I spent time with in Victoria, made it very clear that I was not white. So there was no ambiguity for me personally, even though my mom was a white woman, I had white family. It was kind of okay, well, I'm not part of this group, so I must be part of this group. But then when I went to Toronto, I was just well, it's a little bit complicated than that. You meet a lot of Afro-Caribbean people that have more of a mixed ancestry for different reasons. You're meeting people from different parts of the continent that look differently, not like the West African archetype that you see in Black Afro-Caribbean communities, but also obviously in West Africa and Central Africa. So that was just really interesting to me, and to see how my identity as a biracial person would fit into that. But I've always kind of thought of it biracial, but denominated in Black, if that makes any sense. Because I guess with the mixed race discourse, I never had conversations with people who self-identified as mixed race, and felt like a very strong connect personally, because, you know, how I look and how often somebody who identifies as mixed race would not be like very similar. Whereas I know a lot of biracial Black folks or biracial people that have one Black parent or a white grandparent or something like that. And that to me was, I saw more of myself in their experiences, and I felt it happened the same way. So, and I guess we'll talk about this more, but yeah, the discourse around like mixed race identity and experience to me was something that I was like, oh, you know, like I get it, like theoretically, but I also still felt that like distance in a way as well, because like.
Ekow's video gets smaller and moves over to the left. An image appears beside him. This is one of Ekow Stone's soul tappings, titled Speak, and then in parentheses, Why, Our Grief. This is a play on words. If you include the Y in the title, it says Speak Your Grief, and if you don't include the Y, it says Speak Our Grief. The background is black with gold small circles that form shapes and lines throughout the art piece. In the center, there's a circle that is created out of a plethora of small gold dots. On the outside of the circle, there are free-flowing lines that connect to the border of the art piece. Within the circle, there is an illustration of a head turned to the side. From the eye, there's a gold line that resembles tears that falls downward on the face and connects to the mouth. This gold line then exits through the mouth and forms a branch outside of the head. The image then disappears and Ekow's video goes back to normal.
Ambiguity or white passingness was never in my experience. So, yeah, I don't know. Like, I just talked about the art and then talked about the identity stuff. But it's funny with my art. I like to get outside of identity, if that makes any sense. I used to be like, oh, you know, what's this, what's that in me, but I kind of like to kind of explore in a spiritual sense, like worlds outside of the domain of identities and those sort of constructs. And so I think it's in the work. I think people can see it in the work. People have made some interesting comments about the work. In that perspective, but it's when I'm making the work, I'm not really thinking much at all, really. It's only when I'm finished that I'm just like, oh, you know, this is probably what it meant. And I mean, I've been copying this sculpture that I took a picture of for a while, so that's probably what I was thinking about. But yeah, it's kind of parallel universes almost, where it's like identity and navigating different spaces, and especially in art contemporary culture, where it's like people have a litany of identities, right? A litany of experiences that they speak to. And there's a lot of discourse and discussion about that. And my art practice, which is just like, you know, trying to access worlds in ways of being that are not so modern, I guess. Yeah.
It's a really great point. And I love that there's so much diversity and perspective, even within this panel, right? Because I feel like even I find challenges with using the term Black art for this reason, right? Because it's like, what makes the artwork Black, right? But it's like oftentimes we use it as a term because it's, you know, easy for people to connect to, or it's clear, you know, who's going to be at this art fair, at this, you know, presentation. But the work is not necessarily about, you know, not every artist has identity, you know, built into themes that they're exploring. And so we have this challenge of simultaneously trying to say, here are the folks that we support and the artwork that they create, with trying not to label it, but then, you know, very squarely labeling it. But I mean, I think it's something that I always try to bring forth is like, yeah, Black art is everything, you know, it's everything that could possibly be, you could think of, right? Because Blackness is expansive. So there needs to be room for work that's conceptual or work that's not really clearly, connected to identity or traditional ways that we think about identity. So I love that that's part of your practice and approach as well.
Ekow, can I respond to you as well?
Definitely. I'm listening. I'm just turning off this fan. Sorry, I'm listening.
Okay, no worries. I thought it was really interesting about the ambiguity that you mentioned, that you don't get to sort of have the ambiguity about being white passing, and that's something that I have really explored in my space, where I grew up being, having curly hair, being visibly, a bit dark. And I wasn't always the darkest, right? Like there's Inuit who are dark skinned, who get very tanned, especially in the summer. So I wasn't always, the more Black identifying student, if you would, visualize a classroom of students. And I went through where I was in a majority Inuit classroom, where we had Inuit teachers up to, and even half day up to grade 4. And, but there was, so I have a quick story where, because I'm in a mostly Inuit environment and place where a lot of people are mostly Inuk, there's a lot of people who, if they came to Iqaluit, they wouldn't always know who I was. So they would see me and I would be Black passing, they would, and the way, and they identify me as like, oh, and they'll say, oh, I thought you were Khalunak, which means I thought you were, we call white people here Khalunak in terms of just like identifying that it's a place of where people would go and collect certain things that they would gather was from these people. And so they would say, oh, we thought you were Khalunak. And so when I would start to speak Inuktitut, I would always, surprise people. And so that was something. My daughters decided to visit us. I was always really kind of the opposite, where it's like, I didn't get to be, I guess, Inuk passing, that's something else that I'm still sort of even learning to express. And especially being in a majority Inuit population, and then people who were, of course, from here knew I was from here and knew I was here, but then, and then people who came up from the South would often, try to place me in terms of like, oh, where are you from? And it's like, well, I'm from here. And they're like, oh, but where are you really from? And it's like, no, I'm actually from here. I'm born and raised here. And so I've had to constantly tell that side of things and that story. And I realized that for me is sort of has been part of, that's the exploration of trying to understand how people see me versus how I see myself, versus how I, have learned to identify myself amongst the different viewpoints, I guess you can kind of say. So thanks for bringing that up.
It makes me think about what you just said, Miali. It makes me think about something we had talked about earlier, I think when we had a meeting about this conversation, and just the way in which our geography really influences how others see us and how we identify. And we have been talking about, there are some folks who are mixed Indigenous and white, but they just don't acknowledge that white. And it's, often I think it is because of where they are and the community that's around them and what is understood as being Indigenous. And yeah, it's just really interesting, Ekow, hearing you talk about your experience of living in Victoria, which I've been to Victoria. It's very white. I mean, it's named after the Queen. It's very colonial in every sense of the word. And and like, it makes sense that you would have such a strong Black identity in that space, especially, how you look. But then that ambiguity it's interesting, because I had the experience of spending some time in a small town in Quebec just a few months ago. And it was a very white town, very white, very straight, very like just white. And even I, in that space and being read as not quite white enough to, be that comfortable with like for folks to be comfortable with who I am. So it's just really interesting how geography informs that part too. So just something I wanted to mention.
When I was in Ghana, I think this woman like called me like white several times, like teasing me about it. And it's like when if you're in a like a homogeneous, and I mean that in a very reductive, crude racial sense, homogeneous area, like whether it's white rural Canada or West Africa, where it's like everyone is black, there's no real settler presence at all. So there's not really the complications around race that we have, and everybody's just like more so their ethnic background, their language, their religion than their race. That's if somebody like me comes through, you know what I mean? I have freckles, I have certain features that they're just like, that is not fancy, that's not Ashanti, this is a brony, right? Outsider or whatever. So yeah, geography, history, all of these things play a huge part. And I think in Toronto, it's just like so culturally diverse. And so it's like everybody's coming with different backgrounds and experiences and baggage and trauma. And like, it's like really interesting to see, how it's going to play out. Cause it's wild.
It is true. It also, that those comments around geography make me think too of the difference with Jamaica, because there are some elements or like ways in Jamaica where people of different backgrounds are still just seen as Jamaican. Like, it's like, that's a Chinese, like you could be Chinese Jamaican or Indian Jamaican. And it's like, someone might refer to, as a Chinaman, but you're still just seen as another Jamaican. And the differences are really segmented across like class, across color, other forms of like markers of privilege, but there's not so much of this like, I need to differentiate or understand that you're Chinese or, white or what I might perceive as white or mixed, or it's just, do you speak enough Patois for me to feel like you're Jamaican? Oh, okay, there's that. And then there's like class applied to that. So yeah, it is interesting how however homogeneous a community is influences how people perceive you.
So just wanted to quickly comment too on Ekow, you mentioned this, how your work kind of like transcends these things that are projected onto us, all the ways in which we are perceived, and like it's a space for you to just be and explore other things. And I feel very similar with my practice in terms of just like creating other worlds for me to exist in, like drawing weird spirit beings and just being weird and like just being my full self in my art practice. Like it's a safe space for me to just exist as I am in all of the multiplicities of who I am. And I think that's a really beautiful thing about art. And I just wanted to say that, that really resonated with me.
Thinking, I guess, a bit about the intersections of different communities and how much community, as we've been talking about, plays a role in how we perceive ourselves. I was wondering if folks had any experiences with community programs or community spaces that really shaped your understanding of yourself and the intersections that you stand at.
I'll just speak briefly about learning the language, because that's something that I started later in life. I was in my late 20s when I first started learning Onyada, which is the Oneida language, which is very close to Ganyangeha, which is the Mohawk language. And it was not in a community space, it was in an academic space at U of T, but there is a community space within there called First Nations House. And that's where a lot of the programming for the Indigenous Studies program took place. And my Oneida classes felt like a community space. My teacher was Grafton Antone, and he really created a community space because he was just doing like in the Ongwe Hongwe Neha, so in the way of our people. And it really was such a powerful experience for me, having not grown up with the language, having not grown up in community, having, very, in many ways fractured identity, having always to sew those pieces together. And language is a really beautiful way of integrating things, because it just happens naturally when you start to learn your language. It's a gift. It's a real privilege to get the opportunity to do that. It's a very healing opportunity, or a very healing process. Learning the language is also very painful. So it's like being in that community space for learning the language was incredibly impactful for me. It definitely influenced how I even raised my daughter, and just continues to impact my life. The more language I learn, the more I feel impacted in a positive way. But there is a process of sort of going through the pain and the shame of not knowing the language, and the shame of struggling with it, because when you aren't living in community and you don't have language speakers to share the language with, it's very difficult to pick it up. Because we're not talking about a Latin-based language. There's no, when you're raised in colonial white supremacist propaganda, which is our education system, you're surrounded by Latin language based things, so you have that basis, and not having the basis, you're relying on blood memory. And that's where a lot of shame comes in too, because it's like, oh, I'm not getting this, I must not be really Mohawk, or all of those things that can come up. So for me, that has been one of the most profound experiences of a community space that was like a little community bubble within academia. And then I actually went to a community center, to the Native Center, to learn Ganyangeha from Grafton's daughter, Dawn. Kaya also has been to those classes with me. And that, again, so profound. Just being in a community space that is for Indigenous people is always lovely. It's, it has its complications, but it also is very affirming. And then getting the opportunity to learn the language with folks, again, so profound. So that's something that really sticks out for me.
Thank you for sharing that. I didn't quite understand initially when you were talking about the pain, but then as you were sharing, I was like, I see that sense of questioning yourself, and all that comes with that. And I can only imagine, like, the fact that it's also not necessarily easy to access classes, instruction, making it that much more a reminder of the erasure, and that also being difficult.
And being in an academic environment in the colonial structure, it's contradictory, those colonial constructs are what interrupted our connection in the first place, all of us, to our ancestors and our ancestors' ways, our ancestors' language. So there is that contradiction, but I think that's just existing in the world today. We're constantly existing in a contradiction, especially if we're critical of colonialism and white supremacy. Then it's just a constant contradiction. Everything we do. It can contradict our, core values around that.
I just wanted to respond to what Kaya had said in terms of feeling like she could really be herself and her full, that be safe within her own exploration, because I think that's really important. I think that's part of like the healing journey, and really being able to feel that, I am a safe space for me. And that's huge. Like what she shared there is like, that's still something that I know that I'm really trying to understand, that, just that deeper level of just being like completely the full version of myself that I truly desire to be, even though there are all these other expectations and forces that I am supposed to somehow, fulfill. And so it's very enlightening just to have somebody say that. and be okay with like, yeah, like that's, so I just wanted to really acknowledge you, Kaya, for that. So appreciate it. And also to Jamaias, when you talked about the contradictions between the learning your language and really connecting with that in a colonial setting, that's a, yeah, it is, it's a big, that's a real thing. And for me personally, when I think about community programs, my first community program that wasn't a program was my home, and was my mom, who didn't want me to speak English in the house. And I wasn't allowed to speak any English. And that was her way of saying, well, in the school setting, I wasn't allowed to speak my language, and it's what I have remaining. I've lost so much of my cultural knowledge and practices, but at least I still have the language. And so in our house, we're going to speak Inuktitut. And Inuktitut is the Southern Baffin dialect, and then you have various Inuktitut variations of the language. And so that was a really big decision for her to make, to really just say, like, this is what we're going to do. And then I went to a program called Nunavut Siboney, which is like after high school. I applied, and I mean, I had done other things, but I went to this program in Ottawa where I actually learned Inuit history for the first time, which I was really surprised. I didn't learn that in high school. And so I had to leave my home community territory, go to Ontario and learn about myself and about the territory that that Inuit had regained or claimed as a settlement area. And then in university, it was my first real connection outside of my dad's family and upbringing, where I started to connect with groups that were like Caribbean Society or Afro Society, Black Student Society, and that was at various schooling, various universities. I've gone to a few different ones over the years, and so I would say those were a big integral part of my connection to the Black community. And then for even Indigenous, I went to, and I would go to both sometimes. Like there was an Indigenous center that I would go to in a couple different universities, and those were really mostly First Nations students or Métis students, and often I would be the only one that would identify as Inuk or Inuit. But it was really good for me to make those connections there as well. And then for the Black spaces, there was usually I would be the only one who was Indigenous mix kind of person. And so I was so those were some of these spaces. And then I would say last year, when Obsidian Theater contacted me to be part of 21 Black Futures, that was, I would say, like, in terms of my art and in terms of my my writing, that was the first time I've ever had somebody from the Black community really embrace me and really say, we want to hear your voice as a Black person. And I was like, me? Like, okay. And it was really quite humbling for me to take part in that and to really, explore that side of myself. And I had written a bit about, things that were in reflection to my dad being Black and being Jamaican, but I just, it was another area where I was going to have something that was outside of myself, where it was a really neat and interesting project. And so for when I'm thinking about community programs, I did a lot of work as a youth coordinator from the time that I was a preteen, and I did a lot of like youth work for young, and mostly it was more for Inuit youth. And I realized that even in the work that I was doing, and as a coordinator, I realized that even the young people, there was a lot of disconnect. There was a lot of feeling of, even though you would think, oh yeah, like they're Inuk and they're in their identity, but because of our parents' ancestry and our experiences with colonialism and federal day school and residential school, it was like we didn't realize, even when I was a teen, how much we were struggling with around the traumas that we had experienced. And so a lot of the youth programs that we were doing we couldn't even get to the core of some of the work and the programs that we probably could have done, but we just didn't, it's only more in recent times that we're starting to really learn about the history that has been hidden from us. So those are some of the community programs that I could think of that I've been involved in and that have really impacted my work and given me a chance to explore more of who I am and how I connect with different groups and people. So thanks for that.
So important. I feel like so much happens in community spaces, not in schools and not in, universities and not at work. It's just the care that we have for each other to talk and have honest conversations and reflections and learn, and just having that space is so key to bringing forward all of your intersecting identities and learning to stand at those intersections. I definitely had that experience in school. I feel like I was part of like every student group. I was in Women in Trans Center, I was in the Afro-Caribbean space, I was at Black Students Association. It was just all so formative in terms of helping me work through who I am and standing in that truth. Ekow, I wanted to ask you about the project that you did, your zine, and sort of reflecting a bit about, why indigeneity is not something that we often equate with African communities. Because I feel like that's definitely when I think about just, being in school, like the conversation we were having was around like Blackness and like Africanness and, asking African students to think about what Blackness meant to them. And it's like indigeneity never really factored into that. And I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I, as a way to like honor the memory of my friend, I wanted to create a project that would begin, and it was almost like the universe was almost like, giving me so many signs that this was the right way to go, because the project, is intended to commemorate his memory, and in doing that, kind of give a space to talk about Black people's relationship to indigeneity. And like, as I was working on the project, I was in the Black Indigenous Solidarity Soil Spirit Society, the workshop artist residency program that Jamaias facilitated, coordinated. That's where I met Keisha again, almost. I'd already met Keisha before, but and then all these things that Keisha was doing and other folks were doing that were coming up, that was like trying to affirm that sort of intersection of Afro-Indigenous people, trying to complicate how it's kind of like subtly racialized in a way, like how indigeneity looks a particular way. And it can be white passing, but it cannot be Black passing, and that was, I know it was a source of pain for my friend, and that erasure and always having to kind of explain themselves, when he was talking about his Indigenous experience. And so I was interested in creating a project that would just give people the space, and he's in it. It was an old conversation that we had recorded before his passing. My godmother, who's Yoruba Nigerian, is in it. Keisha's in it, Jamaican and Cree. Friend Cassandra, who's Trini and Jamaican. A Somali person's in it. Like, it's just a mix, and kind of these open-ended, not really structured conversations that I transcribed, and then I did illustrations. I put in illustrations that I was working on as I was like listening to the conversations and working through the project. And yeah, a lot of interesting themes came up. I think it was like people who don't have Indigenous ancestry on Turtle Island kind of being like, oh yeah, it's interesting to think about the practices that my Caribbean family has that have roots to West Africa or different parts. To think about that as Indigenous, I've never thought about that before. Or, you know, my godmother talking about seeing Yoruba spiritual practices in Cuba, and like kind of complicating and expanding this notion of identity, indigeneity, I guess, was just interesting to see these like themes come up. And then obviously when I had to my friends' conversation, and with Keisha, they had a lot to say because the erasure is just so poignant. But it's really cool now to see conversations like this, and projects and initiatives related to like Afro-Indigenous folks. I'm not Afro-Indigenous, obviously. I already, like, y'all know what my background is. But you know, it was like complicated for me too, where I was just like, you know, my dad, Fanti is an Indigenous language. Like it's Tree is an Indigenous language, like Yoruba, like by definition, right? I'm looking at the definition of looking at the experiences, the food, the clothing, yet that's not in it. And one of my friends who's Igbo, who's in the zine as well, kind of made the point of this, I forget what it was called. It was some film festival. I think it was an Indigenous film festival, and it was about Indigenous films all around the world. And it was obviously the Americas, Scandinavia, and along Siberia, like Northern Europe and those in Northern Asia and stuff like that. And they just skipped over the entire continent. Like there was not a single film about Indigenous peoples on the continent. And so this is really interesting to think about Black people, Africa, the diaspora, and you know how we think through these things, that the idea of people who have been displaced from their Indigenous land for different reasons, whether through migration, colonialism, or the transatlantic slave trade, are not framed in this way. And that's what that project kind of illuminated on one side, and then it also illuminated the complexities of Afro-Indigenous people, Black passing, right? Indigenous people on Turtle Island. So that was the project intention, was just trying to give a platform, something simple, be complicated, just transcribe dialogues with people. And yeah, that's kind of the premise of the work. Yeah.
Really a beautiful project. And I love how you mentioned, yeah, it's sort of pushing the boundaries and pushing the conversation amongst folks who are beginning to think about that, right? Are beginning to think about language, traditional religious practices, cultural practices as being part of this larger community of indigenous folks. And it complicates, once again, people who identify as, you know, Black or being part of a diaspora in on these lands, because we're constantly, I think, in this process of trying to connect back to other lands and have been displaced as a result of it. And it's definitely just another moment where you're like, what are we trying to reclaim and what are we trying to bring forward, and what parts of that are part of an Indigenous tradition? Was there anything that came out of the zine or your interviews that really struck you or was insightful or has sort of stood out?
I guess that there's like no proper conceptual framework to sort of like contain these things and make it like translatable and communicable. Like I don't know. I have another friend who's just he's Black as well, and he's just like, yeah, no, I don't think Black people are Indigenous. Like that's not that notion in of itself is a colonial. Like he's very like, you know, like, so it was just, he's not in the zine. I had conversations with him after, but it was just like, you know, when I did the project, I was just like, oh, you know, like this is one set of ideas about a set of experiences, and there's just millions of others in languages that are not even, you know, the ones that we're speaking now, right? So I think the biggest insight of the project was just how infinitesimal or like tiny it really was. And that, like, especially in like the North American, like liberal, like identity based system, like very like, I am this, I am that kind of thing, like to different communities, this is just like, you know, what, and it's also doesn't have to be that, you know. And so it was just like, it was more of just like, after I finished it, some years passed, and my ideas around Blackness changed. I kind of realized that, you know, it was yeah, like significant, but also very like one little thing out of all the things, if that makes any sense. Yeah.
But an important one. I still think it's an important conversation.
Yeah.
And sort of harkens back to, I feel like what Jamaias was saying at the beginning of like, sometimes we still come back to that place of wanting to compartmentalize and put things and have these sort of strict ways of understanding. And so there's so much nuance and complexity within all of our identities and with all of our lineages. I just think of like people recounting their lineage in this conversation alone, and there's so much patterns and movement and migration and, you know, relationships that span, you know, 5 people on a call, and then you just add in infinite amounts of layers to that when you think of a diaspora, particularly in this context on these lands where people come from all over. Like the Black community is from East Africa, West Africa, South Africa, the Caribbean, America. Like it's just, it's a lot. It's a lot of narratives and people that wouldn't necessarily meet up anywhere else. So I feel like that's such a unique thing about Takaranto and Turtle Island, and our sort of all of our journeys to get here to this, you know, moment for us to be on this call is just wild to think about all of the crisscrossing and decisions and force and consent and love and struggle that went into people, us arriving here. So it's small. It is small, but it's fascinating.
Yeah, I really like what Ekow was saying, and I was just probably, I'm taking notes as well, and I have a couple things that I wanted to bring up with if we were able to. I don't know if you've done like a watch party for your zine. I don't know how would people kind of participate to view it? Is it like a visual? Is it audio? So I was trying to understand what that was, and so I was curious a little bit about that, and then just based on what you were saying and wondering, you know, some of the reactions that you kind of were able to collect from it. If you kind of chose a specific group of people that you wanted to get a reaction out of, or did you kind of just, you know, did you draw on people who were sort of like who you wanted to get a reaction from that were able to share some of their honesty over your work around that? And so I was curious about that, and then I can add more a little bit after I hear from you if you wanted to respond to that, Ekow. But that was just a thought that I had.
Yeah. So I have like over 50 copies still here that can be sent out. There's also a digital copy available to just look at for free. And I have the recordings, but I don't think I'm going to share audio recordings. I actually don't know where they might be on SoundCloud. But in terms of like the people I selected, it was incredibly biased. It was just like, who are the Black folks I know who have a very interesting perspective on what it means to be Black right now. So it was like all friends and family, and some of it wasn't even consistent. Like some of it was retroactive. So with my godmother, it was not even, it was just a recording of a conversation that we had before any of the idea of the project came up, but the themes that she was touching on were actually about how she became Black when she moved to Canada. And so I thought that was interesting because like, it was, you know, when you're in a place where everyone is of a particular race and there is no, you know, kind of like white presence to make you feel other, it's like there's not very much cultural resources for, you know, people to be like, I'm Black. It's more like, oh, I'm Yoruba, Christian, you know, upper middle class, like kind of what we talked about earlier. So she was talking about that stuff. And I thought it was interesting to think about that in the framework of indigeneity. And then, yeah, but it was like retroactive with my late friend, with my godmother. And then I had formulated the questions and I had very biased, like, was like, Keisha seems very smart and articulate about these things. Let me reach out to them. My friend, you know, here seems very great. You know, like I'm gonna reach out to them, and that's kind of how it played out. And it was funded by Q Working Arts, little micro grant based here in Toronto. So there's a little bit of money there too to compensate people for their time and get it printed and stuff like that. But yeah, that's kind of the approach. It was very yeah, emotionally led. Yeah.
Labor of love.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
I did want to just spend a little time talking about solidarity, since that is the theme of the gathering this year. And I think it's a really important theme, obviously, that's driven and underpin this conversation. So I wanted to create some space to hear from folks what you know, what solidarity means to you. You know, it could be what sort of an initial word or thought or concept that comes up when you hear that word, and then we could, you know, delve deeper. But initially, yeah, what comes to mind when you hear the word solidarity?
I think for me, when I think about solidarity, I think like an image of like a bunch of people standing together. And then I think about how we show up for each other in the best ways possible, like ways that are affirming and helpful for one another. I think about how solidarity takes a lot of work, because it takes work to show up. It takes a lot of unlearning of the systems that, at least like the colonial Western systems that we're raised in, that don't teach us how to show up for each other, really. I think a lot of showing up I've learned through being in community with people. And I think a lot of people feel threatened by that work of showing up, because there's a lot that you have to confront within yourself, like confronting your whiteness or your anti-Blackness or your transphobia or your ableism. And so instead of doing that work, like they'll actively oppose it, which is super counterproductive. So yeah, for myself, I try to orient myself in spaces where people are open to doing that unlearning and having those hard conversations around what solidarity looks like, and how we can actively participate in it. And so for me, I'm very inspired by, Ekow mentioned Soil Spirit Society. I was part of the first sort of cohort of that program, run by my mom, which was called Project Future. And it brought together Black and Indigenous youth. And we were able to just see each other in space weekly. We came together to create, and it was such a beautiful space. And I think that's where a lot of my confidence and just being able to create work to like be my full self was born in that space. It was a very safe space to create. And just have, yeah, my artwork celebrated. That felt really good. So I'm continuing the legacy of that work in a way by, I'll be running a program in February called Relations with Place. It's going to be an online residency for queer, Black, and Indigenous youth to just explore what their relationship to place is, specifically to Toronto, And we're just going to be looking at how that informs our identity, what we want to see in the future, what we need from each other to be able to be our best selves and build the future that we want to see. That's work that I think is really important. And I just like, that's a lot of what I explore in my practice is future building. What do I need to have a joyful and abundant future? What do I want for my kin? And so I'm really excited to make that space and just hold that space for youth, because that space was very generative for me as a youth. I mean, I'm still a youth, I'm 24, but yeah, I'm excited to hold space for those conversations and to see what happens. Yeah, that's what comes up for me thinking about solidarity.
I love the fullness of it for both yourself and a vision as well for building solidarity across communities with another generation. Beautiful.
I'll jump in since Kaya mentioned me and also the programs that I was running. I think, yeah, everything that Kaya said, I really resonated with, your definition of solidarity, Kaya. It's hard work, and it is a lot of unlearning. It's a lot of self-regulating, I think, in spaces. It's a beautiful space. It's a scary space. It's a potent space. There's a lot when we're in spaces of solidarity that are really, specifically intentionally solidarity spaces. I've been able to be witness to the beauty of it. I've been witness to the struggle of it. I've been in the middle of it, in terms of, that when with running these programs, which is work that I was very privileged to do for 6.5 years at an arts organization in the East End of Toronto, doing land-based artistic mentorship programming for Black and Indigenous youth. And it's really critical, I think. A lot of my generation grew up with conversations about like idealized solidarity, so without really getting into the understanding of the complexity of it, but like the ideal of like a rainbow world, and like, let's all join hands and sing kumbaya. And that's not what it is. It's a lot of internal reflection in how we show up for each other, and what we're bringing with us, whatever, like Kaya had mentioned, whatever baggage we're showing up with. And that's for I see it across the board, the spectrum of Blackness, the spectrum of indigeneity. There's a lot of pain that we're all showing up with, a lot of trauma, some of it is shared and some of it is very individual, and it often can get in the way, I think, of finding that solidarity. So it's also that personal healing that is really critical, and I do believe that we can have that ideal world where we can all be validated in a space together, but it takes a lot of work to get there. So yeah, but it can be beautiful.
Lots of work. I would agree with that. Trauma reflection. I'm not going to echo everything that everyone says. So Ekow, do you want to? Could be a word, could be a phrase, could be a concept, could be an image.
Yeah, like I think I think about when I think of, I'm very like thinking a lot more about relationships and interpersonal dynamics more than like systems, nation states, like that big abstract stuff, because that's normally where solidarity was kind of discussed a lot of times when it would come up in an academic setting, and particularly and in the activist offshoots of the academic setting, where the solidarity would be very macro. And the term hasn't come up in my thinking and in my discussions, honestly, since I kind of more moved away from that sort of space. But I think it's more concrete and like substantial in an interpersonal dynamic. Like when somebody says something that, you know, offends you, how are boundaries being set? How can resolve be met? How is conflict resolved? In these very normal, real, day-to-day, you know, places, and like at the workplace, you know, or in like some voluntary like community group or something like that. Like that's kind of, I don't know, it's where I've been thinking a lot more about solidarity. Because I work with youth. I work at a farm that's has so many people from different backgrounds and experiences, and that's where I'm like really thinking about, I guess, solidarity. I mean, I just said I'm not really thinking about it, but like I'm realizing that that's the kind of concept that I could label as like how do we have these different people from different experiences really actually like respect each other, and like move through ignorance, you know what I mean? Like move through like a genuine place of not knowing, and how does like education happen? And like how do we really engage those like uncomfortable situations at an interpersonal level? Because I feel like that's the building block, and anything that's like big macro stuff is like can be really jarring and overwhelming, and that's I guess, yeah, that's what, and I think that's what everybody was really saying as well, honestly. I'm not trying to say anybody was saying otherwise, but I guess I just haven't thought about solidarity in a while, because how it was introduced to me was in a very like macro context. But it was really like, you know, harkening back to Jamaias' program, where it was just like, oh, it's just like people interacting with each other in a space. Like, how do we actualize this? Those are the kind of places I think solidarity is important and makes more sense to like be present in, I guess. But yeah, those are my 2 cents, sort of.
I love that. I really wonder if we're going to look back at like the digital activism that's happened over the past, I don't want to say it's been 2 years, but like really active. I feel like there's a lot of, you know, digital activism in a particular way and form over the past 2 years. I wonder if we're going to look back at it and like to Jamaias' point around like a previous generation having an idealized form of solidarity. I just wonder how we're going to look back and see the digital activism. I'm very curious about that.
It's a really good question. I think I've had very idealistic ideas about it growing up. Like I thought everybody had to agree with each other, and everybody had to all have the same, you know, come to the same conclusion. And the government system that even we have sort of reflects some of that sometimes, even though I don't know how much of it is cultural. Where I am, we have a consensus government, and a consensus government kind of gives not a lot of space for conflict, or it seems to. So it's sort of, you know, we're still trying to understand a lot of that. And so when Inuit were coming back to really identifying as like, you know, who Inuit were, some of those questions were being put into place, because by the time we had our government, a lot of it was, of course, then influenced by non-Inuit. And so when I think about solidarity, for me, I think about kinship and how Inuit have been really instrumental, not just Inuit, but, you know, I would say Indigenous people have been really big, and I'm sure Black people are really big around kinship and just really making connections with people who are, you're not necessarily related to them, but you find something that connects you, and then you create a sense of kinship out of knowing that, you know, you give a nickname, or you use a relational term that allows you to feel more connected to someone. And so I always really feel like for me, that has become a big thing when I look at, solidarity. And I've sort of also reflected on what is the opposite of what I felt isn't solidarity. And so if I have felt sort of othered, and or people will try to say, oh, you're Puatiki, which means, which Inuit have adopted as a term to describe Black people, but it actually just means Portuguese. And then the Portuguese that came to this region were the darker skinned people during the whaling time. And so then the idea that the people who were darker were then Puatiki, which is the term Portuguese. And so people will say to me, oh, you're Puatiki. And I will go, well, actually, like, I'm Inuk. And so for me, part of solidarity for me is like, trying to help people to understand, even though, yes, like you might see me as, Puatiki, or you might see me as somebody who's from, somewhere else. Like there's still a reason that I can be connected to the community. And so even though I feel like it's good to look at, well, what isn't solidarity, I've also tried to look at what is solidarity within my sort of even my privileges. So I have certain privileges of, being able-bodied. I speak my language. I have very strong ties with my family members and my culture. And so how do I help others who feel that they've been, they're disconnected, and so then therefore they don't feel a sense of solidarity at all? Where do I, fit in when it comes to giving individual solidarity? Or, where do I feel that I've been able to serve as a person who I can, make sure that I'm not using the colonial influences on my life to make decisions that are impacting people, not just, in my family circle, but also as a teacher, as an educator, and as somebody who, people very much place me as other. And so the challenge for me has been, how do I find solidarity? For me, the strongest part for me has just to try to even feel and stay connected. And then I start to feel, okay, now that I feel and I'm connected, how can I then use my place to make sure that somebody else feels that way as well, as much as I possibly can offer it? And so with the, respect each other, as Ekow was saying, I think that's a huge thing. And not realizing that, we may not always have to agree on the exact, same idea or concept, but knowing like I have to be kind to others, and I have to be, respectful to other people's decisions, because like there's no one, perfect way of viewing, because we all come from so many different spaces and places, and and so solidarity is, for me, touches on a lot of the things that I mentioned, but it doesn't really, I don't have like a definitive answer as well, but I definitely, I feel like it's an ongoing thing. But like I said, what can I do personally that makes sure that others feel connected to what I have privileges, connections to, and so that's kind of how I see it. I'm sure I can go deeper into it, but that's where I can share on it right now. So thank you.
Thank you for those reflections. I love how we've gone from the very interpersonal right up to the macro level and thinking about systems and movements, and but bringing it back as well to the ways in which we interact with each other every day, and the individual work that we're doing as well to both better understand ourselves and the world around us, and the people who are around us, and the lands that are around us. So I want to thank you all for your reflections on solidarity. I thought they were rich and sort of opened my perspective as well.
Ginanaskomen nawao, chimikwech, niawegoa, nagramig, for sharing parts of yourselves, parts of your stories, and your artwork with us today. Something that I'm taking away is Blackness as expansive and indigeneity as expansive as well. Black, African diasporic, Indigenous folks of Turtle Island, and those who intersect between both of our communities. We are stronger together, and we need to recognize each other's humanities, especially as we continue to be dehumanized and face oppression and racism on a daily basis. We need to hold space for each other, ourselves, and these discussions and build reciprocal relationships together. Solidarity doesn't always have to be heavy conversations that burn us out, but we need to think about sustainable solidarity, built from love, care, joy, laughter, rest, collective healing, and creating art together. As Kaya spoke to solidarity and Black and Indigenous futurisms, these discussions, these conversations, these folks and their artworks and projects are powerful and will impact future generations. So thank you so much again, Ginanaskop Minawal. And please join us for a Q&A session taking place on November 23rd at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time.
I'm not sorry.